Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. May the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon all of you. Welcome to tonight's episode of Islam and Life. We're here every Thursday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern Time with you. Thank you for welcoming us into your home once again. My name is Maymuna Hussain, and tonight my co-host is actually not in studio with me, but out and joining me online, and this is Brother Khalid Al-Qazzaz. So as always, before we begin, we say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We begin with the remembrance and praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we will begin with a few verses of Quran recited by Brother Khalid Al-Qazzaz.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Brother Khalid. I also want to begin with a land acknowledgement where our studio is here tonight. We acknowledge this evening Islam and Life is taking place on this part of Turtle Island that is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And for us as Muslims, we recognize that it's part of our faith to serve all of humanity and creation as commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to really stand for truth and justice and address inequalities wherever we see it around us with a sincere concern for all of creation. Tonight's episode, we're going to be focusing on emergency legislations that have been happening over the past few months. We want to explore the impact of what happens when we see emergency legislations taking place, and we're going to be exploring a few of those. So before we start getting into our conversation and introduce our guests, we'll take a look at what our research team has put together here.
The Government of Canada defines legislations as written laws or statutes made by the government pertaining to various issues that describe rights and obligations and set forth measures to ensure adherence to these said laws. As with any laws and policies, particularly those born out of emergencies, there are implications that extend far beyond the intended beneficiaries. The effects of these legislations, particularly on underprivileged or minority communities, can often be overlooked. The Emergencies Act grants the federal government a certain level of authority and special powers when it concludes that a situation cannot be effectively dealt with under any other federal, provincial, or territorial law. Although created in 1988 to replace the War Measures Act, February 2022 was actually the first time the Emergencies Act was used in Ottawa in response to the Freedom Convoy, which organized protests against COVID-19 vaccines and other public health mandates. It is now clear that there are serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law, Prime Minister Trudeau told a news conference. Following the implementation of the Emergencies Act, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group issued a statement indicating the invocation of a public order emergency was an extraordinary response to the multiple crises of border blockades and the occupation of downtown Ottawa on what is already unceded occupied Algonquin-Anishinaabe territory. As a civil liberties coalition that focuses on the impact of anti-terrorism laws and national security actions in Canada, we recognize how the implementation of extraordinary state and policing powers can have long-lasting impacts, and that temporary measures can become permanently entrenched. The question arises in regards to the extent to which these extra powers are justified, and where they cross a line on infringing rights, privacies, and freedoms of Canadians, and more importantly, racialized Canadians such as Muslims. Systemic racism, especially in Canada, is quite a prevalent problem, where racialized and marginalized groups are not only under surveillance, targeted, and penalized more than white groups for similar breaches of law, but policies and legislations implemented don't always take into account the impact or voices of these groups. Robert S. Wright comments on the realities of Black people in Canada. We're over-policed, overcharged, over-prosecuted, disproportionately found guilty, and have higher sentences. Numerous legislations have adversely affected Muslims, namely Bill 21, anti-terrorism laws, immigration laws, border policing, disproportionate targeting of Muslim charities by CRA, all of which are considered a form of racial profiling. And new legislations continue to overlook the impact of inherent biases and racial profiling that will affect Muslim communities. It is imperative that Muslim voices be present in the lawmaking process to provide input on the impacts of these laws on the community. Our London Family Act, Bill 86, a collaborative bill by the NDP and NCCM, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, calls on politicians to take concrete action in the fight against Islamophobia, and is still under progress as the Ford government voted down the motion on March 9, 2022, to bring it back to legislature. Although disappointing, this can be taken as an opportunity for the community to refine this bill and address any gaps such as intersectionality, media representation, fundamental rights, domestic and international policy reforms such as housing, wage, immigration, and funding to schools and organizations, all of which affect Muslims. Canadians should hold the government accountable for committing to resolving issues while upholding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and not overstepping on the civil liberties of any of its citizens. We speak today to two individuals who are working tirelessly to achieve this goal: Sarah Mushtaq of Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council and Tim McSorley of International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group.
Thank you very much to our research team. I'm going to actually ask Brother Khalid to help us introduce our guests and open the topic this evening.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's good to connect with all of you again, and from overseas actually, and it's quite late here, but it's lovely to be with my colleagues and my dear guests. And I would like to introduce Sister Sarah Mushtaq, who had the privilege of knowing for some time now, and she's doing great work with CMPAC. She's an experienced coordinator, marketer, and communicator. She's an MBA graduate from the Odette School of Business. Sarah is interested in all things related to community engagement. She has championed many local initiatives focused on bridging the gap between the Windsor Muslim community, law enforcement, the education sector, and politics. She has appeared in the media through print columns, radio and TV interviews. A recipient of the LWE 40 Under 40 Award, Sarah holds a Bachelor in Arts and Science in Political Science and Biology from the University of Windsor. Currently, Sarah is serving as a board member for the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council. I'm also privileged to introduce, I consider an icon in the civil liberties groups, Tim McSorley, who's an activist and a writer living in Ottawa on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, combining his passion for civil liberties and social justice with his background in journalism and policy analysis. Tim digs into the impact of government actions and works with allies and partners to fight for change. He is currently the national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Previously, Tim was the coordinator for the Media Co-op Independent Media Network and also served as national coordinator for the Voix Coalition, defending the right to dissent and protecting democratic rights in Canada. His writing has appeared in multiple publications, including iPolitics, Vice News Canada, The Monitor, the Dominion, Canadian Dimension, and Rebel.ca. He is a graduate of Concordia University in Montreal with a degree in journalism and political science. Welcome to both of you, Sarah and Tim. Back to you, Maimouna.
Welcome. So I want to start our conversation this evening just by just some basics, and maybe if Tim, you can give us an overview of some of the policies and legislations that took place in response to COVID and kind of your assessment and what's been happening on the ground.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me tonight, and it's great to be here with all of you. So in terms of COVID, one of the things that we noticed, so ICLMG didn't do a lot around COVID because we don't do a lot on public health issues, but one of the things we saw that has a lot of parallels to the work that we do is in terms of the enforcement of emergency laws. And so while I can't really comment on, the proportionality of the rules that were brought in during COVID, for example, restrictions on using public places and other things, even though, personally in general, I agree with most of them. What we saw even in Ottawa was a disproportionate enforcement towards people of color, and towards residents of marginalized communities in Ottawa. So, for example, at the beginning, we saw a high number of fines given out to Black residents of Ottawa compared to stories of white residents, for example. There were terrible stories, including one of a Black father walking through a park, and who was, aggressively stopped by police who weren't stopping other people in the park, but singled him out for a ticket. And so that's something that we've seen throughout our work on national security and intelligence, how the impact and the enforcement of these laws are so disproportionate when it comes to, well, in our case, for national security towards the Muslim community especially, but communities of color in general, and also especially Indigenous communities have seen the impacts as well.
Right, and I know in the statement that ICLMG, you talk about setting precedents, and I think you talk about that specifically in regards to the emergency legislation. Sorry, can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that, setting precedents?
Definitely. Well, any time that the government takes such an extraordinary step, we need to think about what the consequences are going to be down the line. And again, it's something that we've seen in our work since, the rash of legislation that was brought in after 9/11 and under the guise of the war on terror. These were often framed as being temporary, extraordinary, that they would be limited in their use. And what we see though is that there's a spread, that once they're in for good, and that they continue to be used in ways that were never given as a justification in the first place. And so that's our concern around the Emergencies Act, is that anytime there's this kind of emergency legislation brought in, that they're careful to frame it as not suspending civil liberties, which is true, but that grants a government a wide degree of power and a lot of discretion in how they use that power. There's always going to be concerns. And so in this case in particular, there's the worry that the government didn't reach the legal threshold for introducing and using the Emergencies Act, and what that can mean for other governments using in the future. And that's one of the things that we always need to be worried about. Sometimes, we get the response that, well, our government, it's going to use these powers in a very direct, in a very specific way. But we always have to think of what's going to come next, and who else can use these powers, and what other situations could create situations where these powers, once invoked for the first time, could be abused. And that's one of the concerns that we have about the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
So if you allow me, Tim, to follow up here, and I want to focus on some of the rights specifically, like particularly here, privacy and the agencies using these legislations to invade individual and communities' privacies. And as you've given several examples, there were concerns around the apps and the tracking with COVID software and stuff. And I know these were discussions, but are these concerns legitimate in a way with the different legislations that you've discussed?
So thankfully, one of the things that we've noticed is that during the COVID pandemic and still going on, for example, the COVID Alert app that the federal government introduced, we did robust research into the privacy protections and how it works. And we were pleasantly surprised and very satisfied that that it was very protective of privacy, that all steps were being taken to ensure that it wasn't something that could be used to track people, that it was actually anonymized and really put the power in the user's hands. So we were very happy to see that. On the flip side, we know that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were instances where there were questions about Ontario police accessing an Ontario provincial database that included information about whether or not people had been diagnosed positive with COVID-19. And so overreaches like that are very concerning. That was shut down very quickly. The CCL, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, just brought that up, and it was thankfully fixed very quickly, and it was shut down basically. But those are some of the concerns that we've seen throughout the pandemic. One of the things with the Emergencies Act is that we still need to, because it was enacted for a short period of time, I believe maybe 10 days, we're still trying to find out exactly what the scope and reach of it was. Clearly, and I need to say this, clearly something had to happen in Ottawa. It was, and across the country, what was happening was completely unacceptable, and people I know were being harassed and were facing violence, and so we needed to see something done. And so our criticism of the Emergencies Act isn't that everything was fine in Ottawa and at Coots and other places. It clearly wasn't. But we need to be careful about the powers that are granted through these Emergencies Acts. So, for example, in terms of financial surveillance, it seems like it was relatively limited, but we still don't know for sure because we're still waiting for the parliamentary committee that's reviewing it to come out with their findings, and a public inquiry that's supposed to start within 60 days of the emergency ending. So that should hopefully be announced soon as well.
Thank you, Tim, for being on watch for all of us, and I think this is an important that your group does that and others, and also for balancing, like giving credit when there is credit and for good action, because it's important to commend things that are positive and remind people of what needs to be done in general. But I want to pass it on to Sarah and ask her, so the concerns among vulnerable groups and minority groups and communities or racialized communities actually are echoed louder. And are these echoes of privacy invasion, of overuse and abuse of these acts echoed within the Muslim community from your experience and from your work in different sectors?
Yeah, first of all, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me, and it's such a pleasure to be on with Tim as well. When it comes to these privacy concerns, I do want to echo a lot of what Tim said in his earlier comments. I don't think we can view a lot of what's happening right now without looking back at the past 20 years, right? Especially what's happened after 9/11 with the expanded national security framework and how that has really expanded and ensnared the Muslim community within it, whether guilty or innocent, and oftentimes with no charges or, just under baseless suspicions. So I think when you look at what's happened in the last few weeks, I'm in Windsor, which is the unceded territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, and the Ottawa Potawatomi peoples. We didn't have it as bad as Ottawa, unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say. I feel for our fellow residents in Ottawa, but in Windsor, there were a lot of comments about how we live in a border city. We've had a lot of people have had to deal with discrimination at the border, with unfair surveillance and things like that. And a lot of people from the Muslim community here in Windsor couldn't imagine blocking the border and getting away with it the way that it was blocked, for a week here. So whether people want to admit it's true or not, there is, as Tim was saying earlier, a discrepancy in how different communities are treated. And when legislation like the Emergencies Act is invoked, or there's discussions now about further legislation that will target protests and blockades at the bridge and things like that. When you have governments and legislation that have Islamophobia kind of built in a systemic way, there is this fear that with any future legislation, it will also disproportionately impact communities like the Muslim community, like the Black community, like the Indigenous community, and other racialized or marginalized group. So that was a long way of saying there's still a lot of concerns, and I think the disproportionate response, or at least perceived response, gives concern for any future actions.
So I want to actually go into a little bit. I know you have a background in law, and perhaps you can kind of talk a little bit more to us. So things like the emergency legislation, it actually overrides a lot of the legal processes. And so it gives Parliament politicians this kind of freedom to implement. So what kind of implications does that have? What are we losing out on? What are the gaps there that we don't really think about then?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern. Oversight in general has been a concern for us. For many marginalized and underrepresented communities. So for example, oversight of law enforcement is not great at best. And then we have federal agencies like CSES and the CBSA still to this day, which does not have any sort of oversight. So when you expand these powers and allow whether it's government agencies, the government itself, or law enforcement to act unchecked, it does give that concern, as we were speaking about earlier, of potential discrimination or overreach to happen. And because of our baked-in systemic problems, that overreach often impacts marginalized communities. So I think the concern with a lot of this legislation, I think both for Ottawa and Windsor, and then, there were protests across the country, there was a border that was blocked in Alberta as well, is why weren't the current powers enough to act, right? A lot of politicians, law enforcement said that they couldn't act, and that was that. So I hope that with, some review of, with the Emergencies Act and other things, we are able to have some sort of inquiry or commission and understand why inaction wasn't enough and why our current legislation and laws weren't enough in this case to act in an appropriate way. I hope it's clear that no one was asking for any sort of brutality or any sort of physical violence against protesters. But when you compare it to other protests, it wasn't the same response when these protests were made up of Black and brown people, right? So I'll just give a quick example from Windsor last summer, when there was Israeli violence happening again against Palestinians. There were protests here in Windsor in support of Palestine, and that protest was one of those protests was really aggressively ticketed, and the argument by police was, it was breaking COVID-19 restrictions and whatnot, and so they had to act, and there were public safety concerns. And so you fast forward almost a year later when, these bridge blockades were happening, and they were also breaking COVID-19 restrictions at the time, although, some of those restrictions had loosened, but they were also breaking other bylaws, right? Like blocking the road, impeding traffic, noise, all of those things. And so the question that often comes up is, why were those two things treated differently? And, the, kind of obvious answer was that the people in both protests were different, but I think we're going to need some further potential investigations to determine whether that was the case or not.
Thank you, Sarah. These are all very good points. But if I can take it back to Tim, who commented on the idea of a legal threshold. And really, in the situation in Ottawa, which was very extensive, and there was so much suffering at the Ottawa community level and other cities as well. And of course, there are some measures that the police takes and others. there was a political pressure on the government to take action and do something really about it. And I think this was a big drive, even though they could have thought of other measures to be taken by law enforcement that are, again, within respect for human rights and human dignity in general. But so my question to you really is, what are the political checks and balances that are set up in the emergency legislation, or that should be set up to avoid the political interpretation of risk or political interpretation of need to action versus legal guarantees of no abuse of people's right to assemble or to speech?
Mhm. Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. And as Sarah was saying, I think, we think there would needed to be some kind of action, but of course, as you said, no one's wanted to see any police brutality, as we've seen in other protests. It's not, do the same thing for everyone. And in fact, what we ended up seeing when the police did move in was a fairly measured response to clearing out a large number of people from an area, which is something that we haven't seen even in Ottawa, when a small number of Indigenous and Black people occupied one intersection of the city for a day and a half. They were cleared out brutally in the middle of the night, and it's unacceptable to see the double standard there. And we would hope that there would be a conversation about how, in general, do we move towards a better approach to managing protests. In terms of safeguards, there are thankfully some pretty robust safeguards worked into the Emergencies Act. So as I mentioned, there needs to be a parliamentary committee struck to review the government's activities during the emergency. Because it was such a short emergency, that committee was only struck after it was ended, and I think they had one meeting last week just to I think establish the chairs of the committee. And tonight, I believe, is actually their first meeting. So it'll be interesting to see what they say. And then, as I also mentioned, there needs to be a public inquiry or an inquiry set up within 60 days of the Emergencies Act ending, and then they have 1 year to report back. So between the two of those, we should get answers. And that's one of the things that we're looking for, is that it's unclear whether or not it's possible that the threshold was met and we don't have the information. We're still learning about what intelligence was gathered and what the government knew and didn't know. But when it was called, from everything that was made public, and still what we know is being made public, raises those questions about whether or not the threshold was met. As in any Emergencies Act, part of the problem is that we can't go back in time. So we might find out after the fact that yes or no, the threshold was met, but in some ways the damage will have already been done. And the hope is that it will make sure that nothing like that, that those kinds of problems wouldn't happen again in the future. So one of our concerns. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Khaled. Yeah.
Yeah. So you commented on the limits and check and balances on invoking. Was it right to invoke the Emergency Act? But really, what are the checks and balances to limit the scope of implementation beyond what is necessary?
You mean once it's actually invoked?
Yeah. So basically, if the Emergency Act is invoked to give law enforcement some privileges or some access that they don't have, and some additional resources, what guarantees that the scope is not infinite, that they can do whatever they want? What are the guarantees in place?
That's a really good question. So on paper, it states that that any actions carried out under the Emergencies Act must follow the Charter. So that, in theory, would be a limit. But in reality, in real time, it means that police agencies and intelligence agencies have a lot of power and very little checks in the actual moment. And so that's one of the things that we're hoping to find out more about, as well as, for example, there was a lot of discussion of financial surveillance and the freezing of bank accounts. And we've known from our work that already banks have incredible discretion to freeze bank accounts and so-called de-risk, people from banks. and that even vague allegations can lead to severe consequences for access to essential financial services, bank accounts, loans, mortgages, things like that. And so, it's clear that if funds are being used for crime or are a proceed of crime, then that needs to be addressed. But what we don't know so far is, on what basis and what procedures were put in place to ensure that if a bank froze an account, or if the RCMP or others gave a list of accounts to those banks to take action, that the action was actually proportional. We haven't heard a lot of stories that would say that they went overboard at this point. And so it seems that they may have kept it within the scope of what was needed. But as you said, the question is, would that always be the case? If it had been a longer emergency, and again, we have to say that if it had been an emergency that wasn't primarily, about, I don't know another way to put it, but of white people essentially for the vast majority protesting, whether or not the response would have been as restrained as we saw during the Emergencies Act. It's, I don't think a lot of people like to think about it that way, but I think we have to, because that's the history of laws in Canada, that any law can be used, and many laws have been misused based simply on the community that it's being used against.
So sorry, Mamoon, I want to ask Sarah that same question in a different way, because I believe, like, we've heard so many concerns within the Muslim community, but even when almost non-existent in the truckers' occupation of Ottawa, that there were concerns that some of these measures, particularly with financial monitoring of organizations or individuals, that it might have extended during that emergency act and been used inappropriately with members of the Muslim community. Is this a valid concern, or is this a concern that you've heard or dealt with?
Yeah, I think any sort of expanded police power or national security or intelligence power should be a concern for the Muslim community because of the last several years of those powers being used inappropriately against the Muslim community, and no real change from that, and no real acknowledgement of that, and saying that this isn't going to happen, or addressing that with the Muslim community in a meaningful way. So yeah, I do think it should be a concern for us because, at this time, I think sometimes for the Muslim community, it can feel a little bit petty, to see these powers being used against people who, there were comments for some of the convoy protesters that they were shocked that police were acting the way that they were. And, as Tim was saying, the response to how they were able to disperse the protests was really gentle in comparison to other protests, but it was still shocking to them. And, that there's an element of privilege there. And so I think sometimes for groups like ours, like the Muslim community and other marginalized groups, you can feel a little petty when you see that. But I don't think we should wish, any of this upon any other group. And I'm not saying that that's the case, but just because these expanded powers were used against the convoy group at this time, as what was said earlier many times by Tim, the concern is that this would be used disproportionately against others in the future, and that's without proper checks and balances and oversight, that's really concerning. And I just want to reinforce again, I think one of the biggest things for me is that why were the current powers not enough, right? Like, why were the current laws and legislation, the current powers by law enforcement not enough? We had a comment by our mayor saying that, law enforcement didn't have the intelligence to know that, the blockade would become a bridge blockade here in Windsor. And, that seems just kind of naive, because if anyone was online and looking at the chatter, you knew that was an idea, that was something that they, could have planned to do, or were considering it. So I just think that perhaps there was a little bit of naivete here on the part of government officials and law enforcement and others, but that's not an excuse to expand powers and then keep them on deck that could potentially be used inappropriately in the future.
Thank you, Tim and Sarah, for these honest conversations. We're really glad that we have you here tonight. I wanted to actually move to the proposed London Family Act, but I just wanted to check with Brother Khalid if you had any other questions before we move that way.
I think it's a good time to put some criticism in the other direction too.
Okay, before we get there, I do want to remind our viewers watching us live this evening that towards the end of this segment, we will be welcoming the floor for questions from you. So if you're watching us on YouTube, you can pop your questions in on YouTube chat there, or you can call in to ask your question. Just find us on our Zoom meeting room, 905-822-2626, and we'll get to that shortly. Okay, so let's move to the proposed London Family Act. And before we get into kind of the details and kind of unpacking that a little bit, I'll ask Sarah if you can maybe tell us a little bit about what that Family Act is proposing and just your general assessment of the situation right now.
Yeah, I think, I have to give a shout out to NCCM here. They've done a lot of the groundwork with respect to this act and pushing it forward and really advocating with all levels of government to address Islamophobia in this country in a really concrete way. So the proposed act is, at the provincial level, and the idea, or the proposed act was at the provincial level, but the idea with that is they were calling for changes across several sectors, right? So improving the education system to make sure that Islamophobia is taught in a concrete way, from a young age, further, I guess, dismantling of white supremacist groups. We've seen a little bit of that both, at the federal level as well, of, making sure that white supremacist groups are marked as terrorist groups. Hate crimes unit at the provincial level that, is tracking this data, because right now tracking hate crimes data is quite difficult. And, you often have to go through self-reported crimes through police services across the country or across the province and kind of tally it that way. And then the kind of support the anti-racism directorate at the provincial level. So, have that kind of provincial agency that looks into anti-racism across the board. So it wouldn't just be towards Muslims, but, there would be some intersectionality there and supporting, all racialized groups. So there's, other things too, like having more representation in the public service, making it a little bit easier to file hate crimes, or not file hate crimes, sorry, but to file human rights complaints with respect to hate crimes. So there's a lot of good stuff within it. I think one of my concerns comes with the way that we, investigate hate crimes, the way that we report hate crimes. The clearance rate from police, currently is quite low. It's very difficult to investigate and to actually prosecute hate crimes. The majority of people don't even report hate crimes to police. We have to remember, the relationship between many marginalized and racialized communities and police services. It's not often great. And then on the other side, police services don't necessarily have the, let's say, emotional intelligence or training, or cultural competency, quite frankly, to deal with certain groups and not re-traumatize or re-stigmatize them when they come forward, with having had some sort of hate act against them. So I think there's opportunity to maybe think of this, there's a lot of great stuff in here. I want to, commend NCCM for, all the work that they've done there, but I think there is opportunity to maybe think of these things a little bit differently, that maybe going through police is not always the best way to go, and that there might be, some community avenues or other ways for us, for many, marginalized communities to address hate crimes. And I would also say that online legislation, I know that the federal government is, looking at that and looking at online hate and social media companies and reeling, online hate in that way. I think seeing that at the provincial level as well would probably help bolster some of I think anyone who's been online has seen how awful it can be. And so I think we need to make sure that, all levels of government are looking at that and ensuring that it's not, it doesn't just slide, and that it's not potentially a breeding ground for more hate in this country.
Thank you, Sarah. And I believe it's, I think it's a good initiative in general to move in this direction and to offer protection, not just to the Muslim community, but basically protection against hate in general, and add more resources and focus on the origins and the reasons for hate against Muslims, particularly. But hate does not really distinguish at the end of the day. However, I think I've heard specific concerns about some of the items in the proposed legislation, and I also heard that some are being reviewed actually after it was rejected from the fourth government. And that the specific one that was alarming to me really was about giving the speaker the right to block specific groups from protesting in front of Queen's Park. And after having this earlier discussion, it is actually even more alarming for me that a Muslim community organization would support such a suggestion, because sooner or later that might be reversed and would be in a different seat. So, what's your comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think I had mentioned earlier that some of that protest legislation would also block protests at, places like the bridge, right? Or international border crossings, I should say. So, yeah, I think the concern there, so once again, is protests are a fundamental democratic right, right? So, protesting your elected officials, your government, being able to voice your concerns is a protected right, but it doesn't come at the expense of, your community members or harming the public around you, right? So I think that balance, it sometimes feels that we overcorrect in an attempt to have one versus the other. So, we need to protect our communities and make sure people feel safe walking around, especially, in light of the bridge, the protest convoy. There were a lot of people who were associated with white supremacist groups who were part of the organizers of the convoy. So just because this convoy was very problematic in several ways doesn't mean we need to overcorrect with respect to legislation that would then potentially harm our ability to protest when we may need to. I'll give an example. I'm giving a lot of Windsor examples here right now. I'm sorry, but in I think it was 2015 when the Idle No More protests were happening, there was an Idle No More protest here at the bridge. So the Ambassador Bridge, which connects Windsor and Detroit. And it didn't entirely block traffic. It was a rolling protest, so traffic was still able to flow, but just at a slower rate. But, the point was to get attention on the cause of Idle No More and get people talking about it and thinking about it. So, it was actually a really well done protest. They were able to get their point across. They were able to use, these positions of power and economic, power and whether it's economic, political, other powers to get their protests and their point across. So if you have legislation like this, that means that that sort of protest wouldn't be possible in the future. And I understand, especially for our community, that shutting down the bridge was really harmful. People were temporarily laid off. It was really a problem for essential workers, including healthcare workers who were trying to get across the border and work, go home or go to a hospital. So, that, of course, that free movement needs to be protected. But like I said, again, we need to make sure that it's done in a balanced and nuanced way.
So thank you, Sarah. And I think what I'm hearing from you now is that it is not a unanimous support of the Muslim community to this kind of suggestion. This is a proposal, and I think the good thing that there is that debate around these issues, and that there are like different voices from the community, some more towards protecting the rights and freedoms of people, and also protecting individuals. And I would take this to Tim as well, and tell him that the Muslim community actually suffered the heat and the violence of extreme right wing groups. We've seen the horrible situation, the horrible attack and killing in Quebec and in London, Ontario. So we definitely have suffered from this. And the balance that Sarah is talking about is actually very important. The fact that you want to protect your communities and the vulnerable groups, at the same time maintain the rights and freedoms of everyone. So, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I think much as Sarah was saying, the Our London Family Act in general brings in a lot of important and excellent initiatives to fight hate and to make Ontario safer. And I think could be a model for a lot of other provinces to look at. But we need to strike that balance. So, for example, giving the Speaker of the House of the Provincial Assembly the power to decide which group might be considered hateful does raise some concerns. We've known from our work that, for example, those who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign in regards to the Israeli government have been decried as being a hateful group. So, to what degree does that open up the speaker to make their own kind of personal decision around which groups may be blocked from protesting or not? That said, I think it's opening up an important discussion about how do we address rallies by white supremacist groups, people who wave flags with hate symbols on them. It's important to have that discussion, but we need to make sure that we find a balance. And just on the other thing that you brought up as well, Sarah, the idea that I think they're calling it the Keeping Ontario Open for Business Act that would actually criminalize protests that block the border or other infrastructure important for international trade. And exactly as you're saying, there will be clearly knock-on impacts from that. If you just say that any protest or any impact on the border is automatically deemed unlawful. And so we need to be very careful about that. But at the same time, we need to be finding ways to make sure that that we're combating and pushing back and fighting back against white supremacist groups, hate-based groups, and making sure that it's not just recognizing that it isn't only in those acts of violence that we need to act out or push back, but also in terms of language and symbolism, that we can't allow it to gain a foothold, to become mainstreamed, and to be viewed as acceptable. So it's a difficult line to walk and to find that balance. But I think that there's a lot of debate and discussion that needs to be had, and I think that this is a step, towards having those discussions.
Thank you both. Actually, we have a couple of questions that have come in there about engagement, so this will be helpful. People just asking questions about how they can kind of be engaged. And so in the last few minutes, I'm just looking at the time, what I'll do is maybe ask each of you to take a couple of minutes to answer these questions. There's two of them, so we'll go through the first one first. You've mentioned that it is imperative that Muslim voices be present in the lawmaking process. What forms of advocacy would you say are the most effective in helping Muslims make sure this is the case? Any one of you can jump in. I know you're both being very polite.
I
can answer.
Start. And Khalid, do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
I'll just say, and I promise this isn't a cop-out to this answer, but I will just say that there's no one form that's the most effective. right? I think one of the things for the community, and this is actually to a point earlier that you made as well, Khaled, that our community is very diverse and we have lots of different perspectives, and we're not always going to agree on everything. We come from different backgrounds, we come from different socioeconomic statuses. And that's okay if we don't agree on everything. That's we're not a monolith. So when it comes to something like this, I think that's also important to understand, and that people have different interests. So I think I'm going to flip it back to whoever asked this, that, look at what your interest is. Is it that you like engaging with politicians? Is it that you like working in the education sector? Do you like policy? Do you like community advocacy work on the ground, whether it's volunteering in, some other capacities? Do you want to work in the public service? So I think it's those sort of questions that people need to ask and find what works, what they're interested in, and then do that, because then you'll actually enjoy the work, and then, and hopefully find a good balance with it and not get burnt out by it or potentially disenchanted.
Thank you. And I want to know, Tim, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure, yeah. It can be hard to find ways to engage and know what the best way is to engage. I don't think that the end all and be all is electoral politics, but we do have a provincial election coming up, and municipal elections across the province coming up very soon as well. And I can say from seeing what's been going on here in Ottawa in terms of the, pushing for accountability around the reaction to this truck convoy and everything that happened, that getting involved, especially at the municipal level, can have really important impacts on what we see in the communities around us, especially when it comes to impacts around policing, impacts around, community support. And so I think that might be a real tangible way right now over the next few months to get involved. Again, I don't think it ends with that. So I think there's a lot of other organizations that do public education. I know that groups in the Muslim community organize lobby days to help, introduce people to their representatives, either in Toronto or in Ottawa. And so looking for those and finding out those direct ways where you can speak to your MPs, speak to your MPPs is also really powerful.
So this second question connects with what? Go ahead, Brother Khaled.
I just want to add to this as an answer as well, as is actually supporting the great work that both organizations, ICLMG and CMPAC, as well as organizations like NCCM, they've laid the foundation. They have the research and the understanding, and I think being familiar with what they do and trying to support or even volunteer or help out, I think is also a good way to contribute as well, inshallah.
Thank you. Yes, that's an important point. The last point that you made, Tim, this question actually pertains to that. Maybe if you want to expand it all. Every major Muslim celebration we see politicians attend in support of the Muslim community, yet we continue to see systemic Islamophobia be a reality. What suggestions do you have to make leaders accountable? Maybe we'll start with Tim and then move to Sarah.
That's a very good question, because we all know that politicians love getting out into community events, and it's good to see them there generally. But I think it's also, maybe in those events that we need to make sure that they're held accountable and are asked tough questions. It's good that they're there, that they're supporting communities. I see it in Ottawa, when there's, summer barbecues and things like that, where it's a social event, but also it's a way to, for MPs to do publicity. And I think it's important that even in those moments that we ask them questions and try to hold them accountable and make sure that they know that, we may have voted for you, but just, because you're in office now doesn't mean that we don't have these hard questions. And I think it's especially important when we're their constituents, that we, make sure that we raise those questions and that people, that they don't get a free pass at all. So, I think that's important. It can be hard at those events too, because you don't want to cause a scene and everyone's having a good time. But I think just making sure that they know that you're paying attention, and also I think that as constituents, When we engage in our advocacy, we're often talking to MPs who are, in other provinces who aren't in Ottawa. But I know that when we're talking as somebody living in Ottawa to an Ottawa MP, we tend to have more impact. So finding out those ways that you can engage directly with the MP in your constituency can also, I think, be helpful as well. But at the end of the day, it's also very hard between elections to hold politicians accountable. It's about speaking out. It's about supporting those organizations that are doing the work to research and dig into it and make sure that there's that those concerns are raised and that they're known.
Thank you so much, Tim. That gives a lot of practical advice. I don't know, Sana, if you want to add anything.
I'll just add, I totally agree with that. I think the political engagement follow-up is super important. But I think for the Muslim community as well, holding our own organizations to account is really important too. So when we are, our mosque, community groups, other organizations, when we do invite politicians, holding them to account, like talk to your board members, talk to your community leaders about why they may invite certain politicians and why they don't invite others, and why they may give some, a platform, and why they don't give others a platform, especially if, the politician ends up having the not so best track record with our community. So I think holding both politicians to account, but also our own community to account is really important.
Thank you. These are
but please
really
don't fight with sorry, I just wanted to say, but please don't fight with board members. They do a tough job as well, but having a respectful conversation there is important.
Yeah, and I hear both of you saying that, whoever we're communicating with, that we really think about how we communicate effectively. Thank you. I think this is going to bring us to the end of our segment. I don't know, Brother Khalid, if you want to add anything.
No, I just want to thank both of them, Tim and Sarah. This was a really important conversation that I think is a bit delayed within our community, and I think we suffer a lot from consequences of such legislations, directly or indirectly. And I feel that we as a Muslim community should be part of such conversations, and we're actually fortunate to have organizations like CMPAC and NCCM actually going through the trouble and the advocacy to make sure that our voices are heard, and having backing with mainstream civil liberties groups like ICLMG, I think is an important, and seeing all working together, I think is a good and a healthy thing. So I really want to thank you all for your hard work, and we hope to continue these conversations until we have a better, safer, and also a country that respects everyone's rights at all times.
Thank you both. Thank you both for the work that you're doing, what you're caring, what we see and what we don't see as well. So thank you all for joining us for this evening's session. Before we end, we do want to say stick around. We'll take a short break and come back for our second segment with Dr. Jasser Auda, where we'll be talking about social and family systems within the Islamic framework. So we'll be back very shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to our second segment of Islam and Life. My name is Maymuna Hussein and my co-host is Brother Khalid Al-Qazaz. Brother Khalid, are you here? Okay, we're waiting to have him join us, inshallah.
Hello?
Assalamu alaikum.
So, Sister Maimuna, I don't think we heard you early on. Can you repeat?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Islam and Life. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to tonight's segment. And my name is Maymuna Hussein, and this is my co-host, Brother Khalid Al-Qazaz, who's not in studio with me, but joining me online. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Khalid.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Again, thank you, Sister Maimuna, for organizing these important conversations. I believe we had a really good conversation about the impacts of legislations on minority communities and the Muslim community of emergency legislations. I also believe, from the other end, continuing the conversation with Dr. Jasser Auda on basically having these discussions within the Islamic framework, I think is an eye-opener, and we should, inshallah, build on these issues. And I don't know if you've listened to the previous conversation, Dr. Jasser, but if you have any comment on that discussion earlier, and then we move into our topic for today.
Oh yeah, I did. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Khalid, and safe trips back, inshallah, and Sister Maimuna. Yes, subhanAllah, this is very important work. I'm really happy that, alhamdulillah, Muslim organizations are involved in social justice work. And social justice work is not just working with the community, but also working on a policy level, working with the legislation, and thinking from the Islamic perspective how we can impact legislation. It doesn't have to be, quote unquote, an Islamic state that is ruled by Muslims or declaring the Sharia to be the law of the land. For Muslims to participate in policy and participate in government in different levels, legislative, executive, and so forth, and just bring an Islamic perspective. And as we heard in the discussion, the Islamic perspective would intersect with any decent person's approach to government, even though Islam would, inshallah, add some brilliant ideas. That would be some other session that we can talk about, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan. And today, inshallah, we move into an important discussion about, and I think, as you were alluding to now, that Islam have a significant contribution to, and that is building healthy communities and healthy societies, and basically focusing on the Muslim, or the nucleus of these societies, which is the Muslim family. And we're all taken by day-to-day busyness and changes and different frameworks that we live within. We want to go back to the basics, really, and ask you, what is the Islamic viewpoint towards building healthy societies and building strong families? What is the foundation, and how did the Quran and the Sharia really protect these families and societies?
Yes, Akhi. As usual, we go back to the source of knowledge in Islam, which is the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if you search the Book of Allah for the word family, or al-usra, as we translate it in modern Arabic, you will not find that. You will find that the basic unit of dealing with society in the Quran is the relationships and not the unit, not family as we call in our today's terminology a nuclear family. The nuclear family is not a Quranic word. Al-Usra is not really a Quranic word. Why? Because the Quran focuses on relations rather than assuming that there is a husband, a wife, and children in a box. The Quran talks about al-buyut, or bayt, but this bayt, where the Quran is saying you have your mother and father, and you have, of course, husband and wife, and the children, and your aunts from this side and other side, and your cousins, and your friends, أو صديقكم. The Quran talks about a household including friends and cousins and aunts and uncles and so forth. And it doesn't really abstract the society into the nuclear family. It doesn't do that. And it deals with relationships in all of these components of the society. The relationship that is called a zawaj or a nikah or coupling, literally, or marriage, really, is actually a central theme in the Quran. And how the husband wife deal and all of that. That is one chapter, if you wish. There is the relationship from this couple downwards that the Quran calls tarbiyah, rabbayani saghira. So a couple raises the children, educates the children. And then there is from the children up that is called al-bir, or kindness. But there is also a nasab, which is the relationship with the wife's in-laws, with the wife's part of the family. And then a sihr, which is the relationship with the man's side of the family. And then, as I mentioned, there is the friend of the family and so forth. And then the Quran is giving each and every relationship its due attention to build this relationship based on the Islamic value. But it doesn't deal with the family, isolating it like that in the way we live in modern life. If you wish, it's an extended family, including friends, kind of approach to family, rather than just the husband, wife, and children.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jasser. Can you hear me now?
Alaikum salam.
Sorry, I know you couldn't hear me earlier. Dr. Jasser, that's a really nice way of kind of getting us to think about the framework or how the structure and social, components of the family within the Islamic framework is. So how does this impact humans and human society and human community when you approach it from this way?
Well, when you approach it this way, you are not really taking a legalistic approach to family. You're taking a relations-based approach, an emotional approach. So when it talks to husband and wife, of course, there is the quote-unquote family law. When people go to court to get married or to get divorced, Allah forbid, you see. But this is not the main purpose of the family. The main purpose of the family, in this case, you're talking about the couple to start with. We're talking about the tranquility. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. So basically, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا is to have tranquility between you as a couple. So the couple's relationship is based on the purpose. So tranquility. And then it's talking about love and mercy. So the couple, their relationship is based on love and mercy. And then the Quran is really going at length, describing so many details of that relationship in a way sometimes that is describing very physical things, but without obscenity. The Quran is very polite, that the child could read and memorize and doesn't really comprehend what the Quran is talking about. And the adult would read and make sense about the Quran. When the Quran says, for example, your wives are a clothing to you and your husbands are a clothing to you, you're a clothing to them and they are a clothing to you. That is a very interesting kind of simile of how the relationship is described. And then when it talks about the children, for example, in the story of Luqman, you see how he taught his child everything from the level of his voice to how to be humble. And before all of that, how to know Allah and love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and so forth. And then when he talks about the relationship of neighbors, which is part of the family from the Islamic perspective, part of society, it talks about different kinds of neighbors, the neighbors that are just physically beside you, and the neighbors where you work or where you are in your other activities, and so forth. And it's trying to build relationships based on particular values and particular purposes. The purposes of harmony in society and balance, and not really taking the the unit of family as a legal unit or as a social unit, the way we did everything in our social life, the way we did architecture, in modern buildings where it's just really a space for a couple and one or two kids, and then they might go. Like, it's really controlled in a modern life. The Islamic architecture is not like that. The Islamic home is not like that. It's an expanded home. And it has places for guests. And it's not about richness and poverty. It's really about a culture that Islam is trying to promote in terms of the contribution of the couple to the society.
Thank you, Dr. Jasser. I just want to remind our viewers that are watching this evening, you will have an opportunity to ask questions to Dr. Jasser at the end of this segment. So you can either type your questions in on the YouTube chat that you're watching, or you can call us in and join us on a Zoom call and ask your question. Find us in the meeting room 905-822-2626. Dr. Jasser, thank you. You're giving us some insight in terms of what the social unit of a family looks like within the Islamic framework, and really, beyond just that nuclear family unit. You've introduced some terms, and I wanted to ask if you can maybe expand on those with us from, again, understanding it the way we do within the Islamic framework. Things such as love and mercy and tranquility. What do these things mean? How do we define them? How do we approach them when we think about the social unit and the family unit in Islam?
How we define them in terms of day to day depends really on cultures. You see, the Quran doesn't go to the particulars of the culture. So every culture has a different way of expressing kindness and love and mercy and all of that. But how it translates into the life, for example, if we are talking about Canada here and how Muslim couples should go about life, there should be a development of these terms in terms of how we live in Canada. So what does it mean to be nice to your relatives or nice to your parents? This could differ from society to society. And we need to develop that without legalizing things too much. I think one of the problems we have in dealing with family from a Muslim perspective is that we legalize. I call it in Arabic the fiqhizing of family. Everything is about asking a scholar about how people can communicate but the scholars are not trained in communication. They are not trained in education, for that matter, or early childhood. They are not trained in, let's say, rearing children in particular, feeding them, So what we need to do is to go beyond the legalistic approach that really is dominating our talk about family and get into the social issues proper in terms of how can we achieve these purposes in our context. What is this definition of family? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran is talking about al-al, ala Ibrahim, ala Imran. That is not necessarily the family of, that is the tribe of, like the extended family. Now in Canada, since we have those nuclear families and couples scattered, how can we link the extended family? How can I continue to be linked even though the families, many of them are overseas, many of them are in different cities? How can we continue to build a family despite the fact that we are scattered in a nuclear way rather than living in a compound as the Quran assumes, kind of assumption.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Jasser. I'm glad you made this distinction about approaching Islam not only from a legalistic point of view of limits and what to do and what not to do, what's halal and what's haram. That's important because that's some of the boundaries. However, specifically with the notion of family and relationships, you've identified some interesting purposes for these relationships. But how do we, again, from an Islamic reference or Islamic point of view, go about as a couple, as parents, as children, or as grandchildren, what do we look for? What do we achieve in a new relationship, or in, like, what are we trying to achieve as what you've identified loosely as a family?
Well, subhanAllah, what we are trying to achieve the objectives or the maqasid of marriage, really, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about in the Quran. So he said, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. From amongst his signs that he created mates for you so that you have tranquility. So what we need to achieve is, how can we achieve the tranquility between us as a couple? Obviously, tranquility or harmony has a physical side and has a financial side and has a relations with in-laws side and children, if any. The family in Islam is not just about the children. It's, as I mentioned, the basic unit is the couple. And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that Allah gives children from whomever He wants. Some couples have children, some don't, and some have boys and some have girls, and some have mixed of boys and girls. So if there is if there are children, that is part of the family, but that is not the only part of the family. That's not the only mission of the family, if I may say. The basic mission is, how can the couple live a balanced and tranquil and love and mercy and ma'ruf. Al-ma'ruf is to be good, to be kind of couple. And when we do that, we are able to raise the children better, and we are able to be good to our parents in a better way when we have a very strong unit between the couples. And that's, to my understanding, why the Quran is giving us those hundreds of verses on the couples and every detail. What do? We make sure that we are up to the Islamic standards of love and mercy. And I'm not talking about desire necessarily. Of course, it's a component. But love and mercy in Islam is actually at the level of harmony. How can our marriage add to us, not take from us? You see, how can it be something that enriches our lives? And if we have an issue, how can we deal with the issue? When we have issues, unfortunately, as families, we tend to go to people who counsel, and many and most of them are actually not Muslim. Actually, I know of very few people around the world who are actually Muslim counselors. And therefore, sometimes there is a gap of values here. People come to counsel us or to solve our problems because they lack the values from the Islamic perspective. And people who have the values, like some of the sheikhs that we ask, they are not professionals in how to deal with some of the complexities of the relations between the couple. Things are not working in a particular area, and sometimes a fatwa doesn't solve that. It doesn't really work. You need a professional. So as a community, I think we need to put some light on this. We need to encourage our professionals, our children, to learn about these professions and get into them and be part of solutions for the problems that Muslim families go through.
So it's an interesting approach to look at family in a different way, and you've made that distinction clearly. And sometimes it's also clearer to identify things with the opposite. So, what is not an Islamic family? Like, what is not an Islamic relationship, and like these boundaries that we should not cross to take us for, not just to do halal and haram, but to not act or function in an Islamic way.
Sure. In terms of halal and haram, everybody knows what an Islamic family is and whom to marry and whom not to marry. And this, like that, of course, to be within the borders of the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put. So that's aside. We need to measure ourselves in terms of the objectives and to criticize our relationships in terms of the objectives. Allah is saying, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you find tranquility. Do I find tranquility in my marriage? That is important. And if I don't, how can I resolve that problem? How can I move to a better state where I can find the tranquility? Allah is saying, subhanahu wa ta'ala, as one of the objectives, to maintain what he called in the Quran, hududullah. Hududullah in the Quran is actually mostly about the marriage rules, which is the limits set by Allah. There are certain limits. Are we maintaining the limits set by Allah in terms of a husband, in terms of a wife, rights and responsibilities? And again, not in a legalistic way, but in an emotional way and in a social way, and being good to the families on both sides and the children, of course. Are we maintaining these standards? And if we are not maintaining the standards, then we are not a Muslim family. We have, for example, if we want to go a bit more practical on some of the issues that we have a problem of violence, for example, in some of the families in our Muslim community. And however you translate or interpret the verse in Surah An-Nisa that talks about admonishing, or you want to translate it as spanking, or you want to translate it as isolating, which would be the translation I would do. But the verse is not talking about domestic violence. And no scholar ever talked about what you call today in Canada domestic violence. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he saw domestic violence, as in aggression and so forth, he wanted to do qisas, which is retribution. So when we talk about our Muslim families, this is not Islamic, and it is actually a myth, a wrong understanding, a misinterpretation to think that Islam legalizes domestic violence. How can we address this issue so that we are at the standard of the Muslim family? Imam Malik said that if the husband, if the wife, like when they sleep at night in bed, if she wants him to be on the side where he faces her, and he flips on the side where his back faces her instead of his face, she has grounds for divorce. Okay, for example, that is like something from our history of Islamic fiqh. So if she has grounds for divorce, if he gives her his back, then she has grounds for divorce. If she is violated, or if she is really like the guy is aggressive, or the wife too. I mean, we see cases as well. So that is, for example, a standard that is very kind and very sensitive that we don't see. When we look at the standard of dealing with in-laws and dealing with relatives, and especially dealing with parents, the parents of the husband, the parents of the wife, these are relations in Islam that are described in the most sensitive way. And it is, of course, there are cultural issues, etc. But we need to absorb these things in order to be as good as we can to the parents. When we talk about the family friend, أو صديقكم, Allah is talking about family friends. How can we have those family friends as part of the family, as part of the household? And how can we expand our relationship as a couple so that we are a real building block of the society?
Dr. Jasser, we're appreciative of this conversation with you, and we actually have a live caller that would like to ask you a question. So we'll take that now. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear us? If you're on mute, we cannot hear you. Are you there?
Jasser, we're appreciative of this conversation with you.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Oh,
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Salam.
Yes.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Please
Walaikum
go
salam.
ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Go ahead, please. Maybe there's a delay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yes,
Walaikum
please
salam.
go ahead.
Okay, so Jazakumullah khair for this wonderful session. My question is, what advice would you give to a family, to a Muslim family, in terms of who want to raise well-rounded children who are God-fearing and at the same time engaged citizens?
Thank you. So the question was, what advice do you have for families that want to raise children who are well-rounded
Yes.
and God-fearing and God-conscious?
And good citizens as well. Wallahi, يعني to work on yourself. I think يعني Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying for those who are concerned about their children, فَلْيَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَلْيَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. They should be heedful of Allah and they should say the right things. First of all, before working on the child, you should work on yourself as a parent and your level of taqwa and your level of ibadah. Children copy what they see. And if they see a good example in the parents, then they are able to copy the parents. But you should also know that guidance is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you really cannot force guidance on children. So you do your best and you try to be a good example. But at the end, people grow to choose for themselves what they want to be. And we have examples in the Quran of prophets who are obviously great fathers and great men, and their children became disbelievers and became corruptors. And vice versa. We have prophets whose parents are corruptors and so forth. So that also be part of that. And how to be good citizens is not to isolate them from the society, to define Islam in a wide scope, not as a cultural barrier, and to see Islam in everything in the community. When you see something clean or organized or a nice neighbor or a good park, that is Islam too. Not to define Islam, if I may say, in a political way, like in a way that is only about a particular silo of the society, because that isolates a child from the society. To see truth in everything in what we do, and to also see falsehood in the sense of having an identity, so that we train the child to define that this is Islamic and this is not Islamic in the wider society, and not to isolate. And even if the child is part of a Muslim school or a Muslim community and so forth, it doesn't mean that the child should not have friends from the wider community and from the wider activities. Yes, they go to a mosque, but they also should go to places where they are part of the bigger community and the bigger culture, and not to isolate the child. Also, not to confuse Islam with our cultures as Muslims. And that is a big challenge for parents who would like to see the children Muslims and Nigerian or Egyptian or Turkish or whatever, Malay, and that is quite a challenge, because in Canada, you are Malay, they will not be Malay, they will be Canadian, they will be different. And you need to understand this friction between your background culture and the children's culture. It appears very well in marriages, for example, when a Malay would like to marry a Chinese, and they have a big taboo about that in Malaysia, but not here. If they are both Muslim, why not? I mean, and so forth. Or again, or a Bosnian and a Serbian, or Iraqi and Kuwaiti, and these things. And that is a problem, because we are now imposing our culture as parents who come from a particular background on children, and we call this Islam. So they feel a tension between being Canadian and being Muslim, because being Canadian is actually wide and open to different culture, except for the Canadian culture, you see. So that is perhaps just some thoughts on this.
Jazakum Allah khairan, Dr. Jasser. And I have another dimension, if you can comment on or include. So you mentioned between couples the notion of rights and responsibilities, and I would like to understand how is that perceived from Islamic framework, and adding to it in what is commonly included in many of the spousal relationship verses in the Quran, the notion of taqwa, or God consciousness. That dimension, how does it affect these relationships and rights and responsibilities?
Well, yeah, barakallahu feek, akhi. This is a very important question, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whenever He talks about family, He talks about taqwa. Almost in every verse about marriage, there is wattaqullah and so forth, because taqwa would make you give more than your responsibility and expect less than your rights. And there is an area of tolerance that has to be between a couple. If I define my rights in a rigid way and my responsibilities, and there is always this tension on very well-defined frameworks, that is problematic. That taqwa would make us give more and kind of try to be tolerant with the other person. Rights and responsibilities in Islam, men and women are not equal. Men and women have different responsibilities and different rights. By default, a man is responsible for the support and the leadership before the support of the family. And women are responsible for the welfare of the children of the family, as well as the relatives and so on. It doesn't mean that women are not working, and it doesn't mean that men are not taking care of the children, but there are primary responsibilities that are assumed in the family. Now, when our culture is not fitting with that, it becomes problematic, because we tend to get all the rights. So as a man, I assume that I am going to have all the rights, but I am not giving all the responsibilities that are equivalent to the rights, you see, and that becomes quite problematic and causes us a lot of tension. So therefore, we have to redefine rights and responsibilities. We know that the default is something, and we are redefining them in our Canadian context in a way that achieves this tranquility, this sakina that we are talking about. Okay, the man is not going to be 100% responsible for the finances of the family, for example, as it is in the Sharia, and they are going to participate, and the woman is going to contribute and so on. Therefore, he has to also help with some of the stuff that perhaps traditionally he is not responsible for, perhaps taking care of children when they are very young, which is the primary responsibility of the mother in Islam, rearing them, etc. Perhaps he could take care of that because he is not really, you see. So the cultural changes that we have here that are different from the Islamic norm would make a difference, or should make a difference, in the way we act. The Islamic, like if we talk about the financial side of the family, there are all sorts of responsibilities and rights that dictate the way we deal with inheritance and wills and all of that. And if they are not taken care in the same way, like for example, if the man like owns the house, then it is distributed in his inheritance according to the laws that we have in Surah An-Nisa. But in our culture here in Canada, finances don't go this way. So therefore, he has to make sure that his wife has that house to live in and not to live in the park, as we see sometimes in some cases, because he's saying that that is my right and she has only 1/8 of mine. No, it doesn't work like that. And we're not changing Allah's laws, subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we are adapting to the changes that we have because of the culture, because of the contributions, because of the family unit as a nuclear family in the Canadian system. And therefore, like we have an analogy between this and many other things. And when we get into rights and responsibilities, at-taqwa would make us actually be more tolerant, be less expectant of our rights, and more sensitive about our responsibilities. And that's perhaps how things could work out. Allahu A'lam.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Dr. Jasser. And I hear this concept of, really being aware of our surroundings and our realities and how we kind of live the Islamic framework of family and, taking and in whatever way trying to benefit ourselves and our surroundings using that framework and being aware of our surroundings. Thank you very much for this conversation. I think we're ending. I don't know, Brother Khalid, if you want to add anything else this evening.
Yeah, I just want to end on a positive note. And unfortunately, many of the discussions about marriage and couple end up discussing problems and divorce, and also, so that's the legal, some of the legal discussions, and others we try to move it to more onto the objectives and the purpose. But if you can end us with like a genuine advice about really a fresh starting relationship, and the positive, what are the positive values and what are the values and the positive direction that new couples or newly or renewed families would look for?
Wallahi, Ramadan is coming up, alhamdulillah, next week. Happy Ramadan to you, Akhi, and to my sister, and to everybody who's watching us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a blessed month and give us all the success to achieve objectives in Ramadan. Ramadan is a high time for connecting with Allah. And the best way to connect families is for the couple to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأْمُرْ أَهْلَكَ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَاصْطَبِرْ عَلَيْهَا. Allah told Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, I mean, to have a good relationship is for the couple to pray together, and for the couple to, and of course, the family, as I mentioned, and the extended family and the friends and all of that, to pray together and to link with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If each of the couple is linked to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a better way, and they work on the relationship between them and Allah, their relationship as a couple will be better. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open ways of them resolving any issue that is pending or any problem that they have, because each of them is actually focusing on the source of light and the source of happiness. And that is not ideal talk. I think that is very realistic talk, that things sometimes become problematic when one or two of the couple has less relation with Allah, when they have a problematic existence in Islam, and then problems start. But the more they pray together, they do charity together, they fast together, alhamdulillah, and so forth, coming up in Ramadan, I think Ramadan should be a time for rebuilding families and reigniting that love and mercy that we're talking about, because we are connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the best way to do this, rather than focusing on the material things. The material things, of course, are very important, but this is, to me, a very important cement and a very important glue in that unit, that the members of the family connect with the source of success and the source of light, subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Dr. Jasser. That's really beautiful advice for all of us, and I hope that we can, inshallah, implement it. Thank you all for joining us this evening on Islam and Life. We're just a reminder that we're here with you every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern live. So continue to join us. We'll be back here with you next week, inshallah. Brother Khalid, I don't know if you want to add anything before we ask Dr. Jasser for a dua.
Jazakumullah khair, Sister Maimuna, Jazakumullah, Dr. Jasser, and inshallah, as we see, like the discussions are evolving with Dr. Jasser and with our guests, and we'd love to get people's feedback on our show's email, productions@macnet.ca. If people would like to give us feedback and suggestions, we'd be happy to engage and have more discussions and engagements. I think next week we have an interesting discussion with a special guest on, again, Muslim perspectives in what is happening in the Russia-Ukraine war. So we haven't heard many, or almost I haven't heard some Muslim input to that situation. So really, I think it would be a good way to end this portion of the show before Ramadan, inshallah. And we're also going to have a different look in Ramadan, but we'll keep this for next time, inshallah. So Jazakumullah khairan, and it's just a small teaser for next week, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Dr. Jasser, if you would lead us in a dua, inshallah.
Inshallah. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to lead us to Ramadan in the best way. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Ramadan to be a time of connecting with Him and reconnecting, and to lead us to pray at night and to fast in the best manners, and to be successful and to forgive us our sins, and by the end of Ramadan to be different people at a higher elevation, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us what is best for us. We sometimes ask for things that are not the best for what to ask, and Allah knows what is best for us. So we ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us what is best for us. This is the way He is always generous with those who rely on Him. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وصلى الله على محمد النبي الأمي وآله ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Islam and Life is an online production by the Muslim Association of Canada.